My name is Felix, and I'm a real alcoholic. You ever heard of the set-aside prayer?
Not familiar.
It says, God, please help us set aside everything we think we know about ourselves, our affliction, these steps, and especially you, for an open mind and a new experience with ourselves, our affliction, these steps, and especially you. We know nothing. Show us everything. Amen. So, you ever have some significant medical issues and go to a doctor?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if you're having physical symptoms and you go to a doctor, you're going to want somebody that knows what they're talking about, right? Like specifically if you suspect that you're having problems with your lungs or your liver or your appendix or whatever particular thing, right? Preferably you'd want to go to a specialist in that field. You want to have somebody that knows what they're talking about in that particular area, correct? So you want somebody with credentials, and you go there and he's going to ask you what symptoms that you're suffering from. And you're going to tell him, whatever it is that you think you feel like you're suffering from as far as symptoms go. And he's going to gather up that information. And based on information, he may perform a physical examination. He probably is going to order some more diagnostic work. You may have to come back and do x-rays or whatever the case may be. And then he's going to do a follow-up. And then he's going to sit down and he's going to talk with you. And you're going to be interested in knowing what his diagnosis is, what his opinion of your condition is, and it's called the diagnosis. And given whatever diagnosis, like if it says that you have cancer, right, you're going to want to know a couple more things. You're going to want to know, is there a form of treatment for it?
Mm-hmm.
How long is that treatment going to be? What are my chances of survival? Now we're getting into prognosis. The prognosis is the likelihood that you're going to recover from it, and is it terminal, and how long do I have to live? You're going to want to know these kind of things, right? So we have these medical terms about diagnosis, treatment, and prognosis that are key. We all know that if we've been into a doctor with any kind of an ailment whatsoever, right? So we have the introduction to this book, which is referred to as the doctor's opinion.
Right.
Okay, so typically we don't end up, when we've gotten to the point that we're at, obviously there's been a lot of issues going on. And we probably have come to some kind of a conclusion that drugs or alcohol have something to do with it. Many of us, when we show up, we've already tried to quit multiple times, and it gets more into that in chapters 2 and 3, especially about repeated attempts to quit and find that you cannot quit. And in the earlier stages, we want to try to control it, right? It is the great obsession of every abnormal drinker that one day he will be able to control and enjoy his drinking. Right.
Obsession.
And we kind of, and if we've been around the rooms much at all, or been introduced to the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, we kind of get the idea that, I really need to quit. That seems to be the option, but I keep trying to quit, but I keep going back to it. Why, so why do I keep doing this? Or why am I an alcoholic? This why question keeps popping up all the time, right? So if you went to a qualified medical professional regarding these kind of things, that's what this doctor's opinion has to do with, just like you would with any other ailment. So, we of Alcoholics Anonymous believe that the reader will be interested in the medical estimate of the plan of recovery described in this book. Convincing testimony must surely come from medical men who have had experience with the sufferings of our members and have witnessed our return to health. A well-known doctor, chief physician at a nationally prominent hospital specializing in alcoholic and drug addiction, gave Alcoholics Anonymous this letter. So this first letter here has to do predominantly with the credentials of Dr. Silkworth. Mm-hmm. Many years of working in treatment of alcoholism and drug addiction and so forth, and it just kind of lays some groundwork and credentials. So the doctor's opinion as a whole is broke up into 3 major parts. You have the first letter, which I just mentioned, and then you have a little bit of commentary by the authors, and then you have the second letter, which is the main thing that we study and get the most information out of. So I'm going to jump to the commentary by the authors that are in between these two letters. And it begins, "The physician who at our request gave us this letter has been kind enough to enlarge upon his views in another statement which follows. In this statement, he confirms what we who have suffered alcoholic torture must believe, that the body of the alcoholic is quite as abnormal as his mind. It did not satisfy us to be told that we could not control our drinking just because we were maladjusted to life, that we were in full flight from reality, or were outright mental defectives. These things were true to some extent, in fact to a considerable extent with some of us, but we are sure that our bodies were sickened as well. In our belief, any picture of the alcoholic which leaves out this physical factor is incomplete." Okay, so they're talking about trying to figure out why we can't control our drinking and being maladjusted to life, all right? If I'm well adjusted to life, that means that I'm capable of adjusting to myself to circumstances as they present themselves, right? Circumstances being people, places, things, situations, and events, circumstances as they are. Instead of trying to adjust myself to circumstances the way that they are, being adjusted to life, my history has been being maladjusted to life, that I try to change circumstances to make myself more comfortable. I'm maladjusted to life. Make sense?
Yeah.
So that we were in full flight from reality. You ever change towns, change girlfriends, change jobs, change states, change whatever, right? Like you were trying to get away from something or you were running towards something. In full flight from reality. Does that make sense to you?
That does.
Okay, or we're outright mental defectives, right? After a while, after I went through treatment 6 times and I didn't stay sober after that, I created the same mess again. There's only so many conclusions that I can come to when everybody seems to think that going to treatment is supposed to treat addiction, and yet I get out and in a matter of weeks or months, I'm going back out and starting all over again and creating another mess again, right? So one of the conclusions that I come to is there must be something fundamentally wrong with me. Other people seem to be getting this. I expect to be getting this, but I'm not getting this. So there's something different or wrong about me, or other people were born with something that I was not born with, or they know some secret that I don't know that enables them to be able to succeed at this where I cannot. I tend to blame myself. I tend to devalue my own self in situations like that. It's always some shortcoming of mine of why, right? So being an outright mental defective is how I find my experience of that out of this book, what I just described to you. Okay, so after a while, when I realized that a key component had to do with drugs and alcohol, and after multiple attempts to try to stop and kept going back to it, it was either, in the beginning it was, I tried to control it, right? We cross invisible lines. In chapter 3 it talks about controlling and enjoying his drinking, right? Mm-hmm. In the beginning days I could control it and I could enjoy it, right? I loved to get drunk or to go get high with people, skip out of school when I was going to high school and all that kind of stuff, right? And I was controlling it and I was enjoying it. I could go weeks or even months without any. I would have liked to have some. I would have taken a minimum amount of effort to get something, but I could do without it. Whereas towards the end, I'm chopping down mountains to get the next hit. And it doesn't seem to be doing shit for me, and my crimes keep getting worse and worse and worse until finally I'm arrested and I'm locked up, right? So we have the progressive nature of this whole thing. So then I crossed an invisible line somewhere where I could control it or I could enjoy it, but not both. And as close as I can pinpoint that, it happened around the age of 18. Because on my 18th birthday, I had moved out of town to another town, and my parents came, and my brother was there, and my soon-to-be wife was there, and I had gotten a hold of some weed, and I kept sneaking off to get high, and I was sitting there obsessed all the time, well, how can I get away from these people and go smoke a little bit of weed, and then smoke some, and then then I didn't want to smoke too much because I didn't want to appear completely high to them, because I'd already been through treatment twice. I had recently gotten out of juvie, and it's like I wanted to appear like I was trying to hold my shit together, right? So I would come back to them and hang out with them, and then it's like, well, fuck, I didn't smoke enough. I'm not high enough. And I spent the whole day, I couldn't even tell you what we did that day. I couldn't tell you about any meaningful interaction I had with any of those people throughout the course of that day. I remember listening to the song by Alice Cooper, I'm 18, right? That's the only thing I remember about the day, because my mind was consumed with the idea of trying to control and enjoy my using. And I could either control it or I could enjoy it, but not both.
Right.
And eventually got to the point where I couldn't control it or enjoy it. There was never enough. I mean, I was using to the point where I was damn near falling. I was on the ground. I was either there was not enough, or if I was past the line, I was laying on the ground. I was in oblivion. There was not, okay, I've had enough.
Right. No.
I'm drinking, I'm smoking, I'm shooting, I'm doing everything. You had enough? Hell no. You got any more of that?
Right.
I couldn't control it or enjoy it, either one. So there's invisible lines that I crossed. So once things progressed to that point, it became apparent that there's no controlling this. I mean, that was pretty obvious to me, and I liked the feeling of being out of control. That was part of what I was seeking, was to get drunk enough or high enough or whatever to where I just didn't give a fuck, because then I felt like there was some level of freedom involved in that. I could talk to people, I could act an idiot, I could scream at people walking down the street, I could be the fool. And I like still being able to stand up, but yet act that way where I had lost control, right, of myself. So it was short-lived. The control part for me was short-lived, so it was about trying to stay sober and not being able to. So these things were true to some extent, in fact, to a considerable extent with some of us, but we are sure that our bodies were sickened as well. In our belief, any picture of the alcoholic which leaves out this physical factor is incomplete. The doctor's theory that we have an allergy to alcohol interests us. As laymen, our opinion as to its soundness may, of course, mean little, but as ex-problem drinkers, we can say that his explanation makes good sense. It explains many things for which we cannot otherwise account. So, as ex-problem drinkers, some of this in here he wrote originally was an ex-alcoholic, but then they come to realize in revising it for the final edition that that's not an appropriate way to put it. It says ex-problem drinkers all the time, right? But he is exemplifying the fact that they are on the other side of this thing, and so now this has become relevant information to explain a lot of other things that I couldn't otherwise account, and to properly arm me with the facts about myself so that I can approach somebody else and win their entire confidence in a matter of a few hours, because these are part of the facts that I'm properly armed with about myself,
right,
to be able to help the next guy. So they introduced the idea of an allergy at this point, okay, which is a medical term, and it means an abnormal reaction to a substance. Like most people can eat strawberries or peanuts and they have no problem with that, and life goes on. And then there's a small group of people that when they eat strawberries, they break out in a rash, or if they eat peanuts, the throat swells up. So that's an abnormal physical reaction to the intake of a particular substance. Medically speaking, that's an allergy. So later he's going to get into this, that people who use alcohol or other mind-altering drugs can't, as soon as I take any into my system, that I develop a phenomenon of craving, that I want more and more and more, and it becomes insatiable. Once my diseases progress to that point, that's what happens. And it's due to a physical allergic reaction, one that isn't triggered if I don't pick the first one up, right? That has to do with the mental condition of it. So, maybe I'll get into that further in.
So the allergy would be a detox or a withdrawal, right? Also?
The allergy means that if I take any mood-altering, mind-altering substance into my body, and I'm not in a fit spiritual condition, that I will want more. It might be an hour, it might be a week, it might be a day, it might be a week, but in a very short period of time, and that time has gotten shorter and shorter as the years go by, because this is progressive, that my body's going to demand more. Okay, like
craving.
Phenomenon of craving. We don't notice right now that we're suffering. We're afflicted with a craving for air because we're getting plenty of it, right? So you don't notice it as a craving. But if you put a plastic bag over your head, in about a minute or two, you're going to know all too well what the experience of craving is like, right? And your body, physically, you need oxygen. right? So because your body needs that, your mind will become obsessed with the idea of what do I need to do to get another breath of air. So you have a combination of a physical craving and a mental obsession.
Yeah.
And if you try to take your mind off of the idea of getting a breath of air, good luck with that, right? Mm-hmm. You are not going to be able to take your mind, go think about being on a warm, sunny beach with the breeze blowing and the waves crashing, right? That's not going to happen. That's the insanity that down the road we'll talk about, being in an insane state of mind. You can't replace that thought. You can't redirect your mind onto something else. It is obsessed. That's what we're talking about, obsessed about, okay? So, and it's based on a physical craving. The mind goes to what the body needs. And if the body needs air, you're going to be obsessed with the idea of how do I get a breath of air. And the funny thing is that the spirit dwells within the body, right? So we're going to start identifying symptoms on a moral level and on an emotional level and on a mental level that have to do with our spiritual condition, and the spirit dwells within the body. So to start correlating those things, if that makes sense to you. So this is the first he introduced the solution. He says, though we work out our solution on the spiritual as well as an altruistic plane, okay? So this is the first introduction he talks about as a solution. The spiritual plane and an altruistic plane. So from another book, they use the word commands, but I like the illustration of pillars. That works better for me. The first pillar is love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind. And once you got hold of that and you spiritually wake up, now grab onto the other pillar, which is love thy neighbor as thyself, right? This is not a fucking self-help program. This is me relying upon God to be a useful instrument to be loving towards my fellow man. And I play a middle role in all of that. It's not self-help. So this helps to understand when they read the promises and it says, if we are painstaking about this phase of our development. The phase that they're talking about is the spiritual phase. And then after that, we move on to getting into the 12-step work, which is the altruistic phase. There's two major phases of development that occur. Steps 1 through 11 is basically getting spiritually fit enough to be able to go out and to be able to work with others, to be of service. And this is where he starts to introduce that idea, put whatever labels on that you will. Two major phases of development. That make better sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's so much more into that too, though. Like they cover so many things within those steps.
Right.
But yeah.
Sometimes having a broad view of exactly what's going on and how is important, because I love logic, right? Mm-hmm. I'm a stickler for facts and results. I love logic, and I'm never satisfied with a proposal that doesn't lend itself to reasonable approach and interpretation, which are direct quotes out of chapter 4, that I can readily identify with. So now we move on. He says, we favor hospitalization for the alcoholic who is very jittery or befogged. More often than not, it is imperative that a man's brain be cleared before he is approached, as he has then a better chance of understanding and accepting what we have to offer. So what he's saying essentially right there is abstinence or sobriety is a prerequisite to working a program of recovery. And that's the author's words. That's their way of putting it, okay? And I'm going to jump ahead a little bit to correlate these two, because in the next letter, the doctor says, if you look at the bottom of the next page, of course an alcoholic ought to be freed from his physical craving for liquor, and this often requires a definite hospital procedure before psychological measures can be of maximum benefit. Okay, both the doctor and the author are saying the same thing, that abstinence or sobriety is a prerequisite to working a program of recovery. Sobriety and recovery are two very different things. At one point in time, I had almost 17 years of sobriety, but I was not recovered or fully recovered like I am today. Now I am recovered. So, jumping ahead a little, on page 59, it says, these are the steps we took which are suggested as a program of recovery, not a program of sobriety. Right. And at step 12, it says, having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps. Okay? It doesn't say having remained sober as the result of these steps. Having had a spiritual awakening, I wake up spiritually, I open my eyes, and I recover my spiritual vision. 12-step recovery is recovery of my spiritual vision. Hence the last chapter in the book, A Vision for You. Okay? Bill describes it in his story as, let me jump to that a second.
Being rocketed into the fourth dimension.
That's part of his description. On page 12, towards the bottom, it says, "Thus was I convinced that God is concerned with us humans when we want him enough. At long last, I saw, I felt, I believed." So that's the process of coming to believe in step 2 that we're going to get into, right? What my eyes see and my ears hear and my body feels, I believe. That's a real belief, not some shit that my mind makes up and convinces me of. And then he goes on to say, "Scales of pride and prejudice fell from my eyes. A new world came into view." And then at the bottom of that paragraph, he wraps it up by saying, "How blind I had been." Makes sense.
Yeah.
So, the interesting thing is, if I can readily find this, you ever study this book?
The Bible?
Yeah. Are you okay with it?
I'm familiar with it. I'm not proficient in it, but
Yeah, I don't know if I can really readily find this. So in Acts 9, about verse 17, 16, 17, this is Paul's description of what happened to him. He said, "So Ananias went. He entered the house, laid his hands on him, and said, 'Saul, my brother, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on your way here, has sent me to you so that you may recover your sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit.' And immediately it seemed that scales fell from his eyes, and he regained his sight. Thereupon he was baptized, and afterwards he took food, and his strength returned." So that's Apostle Paul's description.
the scales being the scales of judgment.
Well, Bill described it as the scales of pride and prejudice. So, the point being is that when we talk about 12-step recovery, it's recovery of my spiritual vision.
Yeah.
Okay? And as long as we're on that subject, let me cover that, because there's so many false teachings about all this stuff, right? In the beginning of A Vision for You, page like 152, I believe it is. 153, right? The first full paragraph at the end of it, it says, "The age of miracles is still with us. Our own recovery proves that." Right? It doesn't say our sobriety proves that. It says our recovery proves that. And how does it prove that? So we're going to go back to page 89 in the beginning of working with others, is step 12, right? And it gives us some 12-step promises on that page. The second paragraph on page 89, it says, "Life will take on new meaning. To watch people recover, to see them help others, to watch loneliness vanish, to see a fellowship grow up about you, to have a host of friends. This is an experience you must not miss. We know you will not want to miss it." Okay, and that's the experience I've been having, and that's what the experience I want other people to have, so that they will be able to see and they will be able to know that, in fact, the age of miracles is still with us. I mean, you have to recover your spiritual vision in order to be able to see, 12-step recovery is recovery of our spiritual vision. Okay, so we're going to go back to the doctor's opinion here. I do sometimes have a tendency to jump around a bit. So I've covered a fair amount. I just want to touch on a couple things. So at the beginning, I talked about how when you go to a doctor, you complain of symptoms and you want to try to get his opinion about a diagnosis, that what he believes that you suffer from. And once you know what the diagnosis is, to find out if there's any form of treatment and get a prognosis from him. That constitutes the bulk of what his opinion is, right? So if you're going to go to a qualified medical professional person who is steeped in addiction to alcohol and to other drugs, because you come to believe that you cannot control your drinking or you can't stop drinking, and you want to know how he can help, right? You're going to complain of these symptoms. The symptom being is that you're losing control over your drinking. So his diagnosis, if you read this, is that you're an alcoholic of the hopeless variety. Mm-hmm. If you continually try to quit and find that you keep going back to it, and you have you lose control over how much you drink, that you are a chronic alcoholic or a hopeless alcoholic of the hopeless variety. Mm-hmm. Okay, and that on the second page of that letter, he says, I'll just read the whole paragraph. We believe and so suggested a few years ago that the action of alcohol on these chronic alcoholics is a manifestation of an allergy, that the phenomenon of craving is limited to this class and never occurs in the average temperate drinker. These allergic types can never safely use alcohol in any form at all. And once having formed the habit and found they cannot break it, okay, that's what we're talking about. You form the habit and found that you cannot break it. You keep going back to it. Once having lost their self-confidence, you feel confident about life and eventually get beaten down and you're in a hopeless position and you just have to give up and it's like, I'm never going to beat this thing. You've lost your confidence. Make sense? Mm-hmm. Their reliance upon things human, right? And if you've been in treatment enough times, you've been through enough meetings, you've asked enough people for help, you've tried to go to human people, even friends, loved ones that have begged and pleaded with you, right? Frothy emotional appeal seldom suffices, and they're like, why do you keep doing this to yourself? Why do why? And okay, and you find out eventually, like I did, that nobody can save me from myself, because you got pertinent idea B. A, that we're alcoholic and could not manage our own lives. B, that probably no human power could have relieved our alcoholism. And that C, God couldn't would if he were sought. Yeah. And so my experience of pertinent idea B is that my description of that is that nobody seems to be able to save me from myself, right? If they put me under lock and key and they try to keep me from getting high, guess what? Well, they may hold me down for a while, but as soon as they release me, you got to guess what I'm doing. Exactly. Or I'm going to figure out some method by which to get it into that cell. Right. Okay. Their problems pile up on them and become astonishingly difficult to solve, right? It seems like everything piles up and you give up. It's like what I hear all the time is a case of the fuckets. Yeah. Right? It's what's the use anymore? You give in to your own sense of hopelessness. It's a subjective experience. Okay, so he is diagnosing us as chronic alcoholics or alcoholics of the hopeless variety, right? And we can diagnose ourselves by other chunks of information that are in here, but I think they do a better job of that in chapter 3 than they do in here. Okay, so what you're telling me, doctor, is that I'm a chronic alcoholic, or I am an alcoholic of the hopeless. You know what? I skipped over this. I'm going to go back to it because it says they cannot safely use alcohol in any form at all. What do you mean? What do you think they mean by that? Alcohol in any form at all?
Just any form of alcohol, like any form of, I want to say mind-altering substance, but...
What does your experience indicate to you? My experience indicates to me that after 17 years of sobriety, when I relapsed, I started smoking weed first because that's what was there. The neighbors were doing it, so I knew where to get it. And as soon as I smoked weed, within 3 days, I'm drinking Jack Daniels straight out of the bottle and washing it down with Budweiser. Right. 3 days later, another neighbor says, hey, you want to buy some Percocet? I'm like, hell yeah. And so after I swallow a few Percocets, I'm like, that isn't going to suffice. Then I'm back down in the red light district in the middle of Phoenix hunting down heroin and got a needle in my arm. Right. 1 week it took. Okay? So my experience has shown to me that is what happens when I start smoking weed, okay? And a plethora of other experiences indicate to me that any mood-altering, mind-altering substance is dangerous to me. I cannot safely use anything. I mean, I've abused... you buy natural sleeping aids off the shelf at the drugstore that has melatonin in it and other tryptophan and shit like that. And it's like, hey, that's perfectly natural. Those are plant extracts and it helps you sleep. Yeah, it helps you sleep because it alters your mood. It makes you tired. You take enough of it and it induces serious tiredness. And what I found is that if you stay awake through that, you feel high.
Yeah.
I'll abuse it,
Right.
you know? And I did for a period of time. I started abusing those things. Any mood-altering, mind-altering substance is dangerous for me, okay? So, having been diagnosed as an alcoholic of the hopeless variety or a chronic alcoholic, I want to know, okay, now what can we do about this thing, right? Is there any form of treatment? So we're going to jump to the next page. And my page numbers don't match yours anyway because of the book that I have. It says, all these and many others... Found that spot? The top of the page starts off with important appointment was not met.
Yeah.
Okay, so you jump down to the paragraph that says
I'm
all
there.
these and many others have one symptom in common. We all have one symptom in common. You know, you might be rich, you might be poor, you might be religious, you might be atheist, you might be whatever, but we all have one symptom in common if you are, in fact, in the category of being a chronic alcoholic. And that symptom is that they cannot start drinking without developing the phenomenon of craving. Once I take a few in, I want more. The alcohol takes over. And we're going to get into that, hopefully, about what I call management inventory here shortly. This phenomenon, as we have suggested, may be the manifestation of an allergy which differentiates these people and sets them apart as a distinct entity, right? Sets them apart as a distinct group of people, like the people who are allergic to strawberries. Most people eat them, they're fine. A small group of people eat them, they have problems. So they're abnormal compared to the whole that are normal. So the next sentence says, it has never been by any treatment with which we are familiar permanently eradicated. The only relief we have to suggest is entire abstinence. Entire abstinence. Now, you can take that as you will, but I'm going back to the same thing again. To me, that means no mood-altering, mind-altering crap. That means no antidepressants. That means no non-narcotic pain relievers. That anything that is going to alter my state of mind or my mood is dangerous to me. Okay, so there is no form of treatment. That's the bottom line. We're looking at diagnosis, treatment, and prognosis. Right? There is no form of treatment whatsoever. So the next paragraph, this immediately precipitates us into a seething cauldron of debate. Much has been written pro and con, but among physicians, the general opinion seems to be that most chronic alcoholics are doomed. So there's your fucking prognosis. You're doomed. Right? So if I was really desperate about hanging on to life and not completely hopeless in the case of the fuck-ups, I might be begging and pleading with this doctor that seems to know so much that nobody else seems to know of, do you have any possible suggestions whatsoever for me? So we're going to jump to the next page, and we're going to go down to the middle of it. When I need a mental uplift, I often think of another case brought in by a physician prominent in New York. The patient had made his own diagnosis and, deciding his situation hopeless, had hidden in a deserted barn, determined to die. He was rescued by a searching party and in desperate condition, brought to me. Following his physical rehabilitation, he had a talk with me in which he frankly stated he thought the treatment was a waste of effort, unless I could assure him, which no one ever had, that in the future he would have the willpower to resist the impulse to drink. His alcoholic problem was so complex and his depression so great that we felt his only hope would be through what we then called moral psychology, and we doubted if even that would have any effect. However, He did become sold on the ideas contained in this book. He has not had a drink for a great many years. I see him now and then, and he is as fine a specimen of manhood as one could wish to meet. I earnestly advise every alcoholic to read this book through, and though perhaps he came to scoff, he may remain to pray. Okay, end of doctor's opinion. So what this boils down to is, if you beg and plead with this smart doctor, do you have any suggestions whatsoever that might be helpful to me? This is his suggestion. To talk to these people at AA, to read this book and pray.
Being the solution, right?
Doesn't say go to a fucking meeting. Doesn't say go get a sponsor. It says read this book and pray. And this is a man who didn't have any religious beliefs. That was his final suggestion, if he had any at all. And sometimes I've had that happen in the past, where people, I get them convinced, I can feel it, that they know that they're doomed, right? And they'll come flat out, or at the end of a meeting I ask if there's any questions, comments, or snide remarks. And some will say, well, what do you suggest I do? And I say, well, because I like using this as credentials. This is 85 years old, and millions of people have used this program of recovery. It ain't just me making this shit up. I'll pull this part out right here, and I'll say, well, here is a doctor who is an expert in the field of addiction to alcohol and other drugs, and his final suggestion was this: read this book and pray. So that's my suggestion to you, to read this book and pray.
Fair enough.
So I mentioned getting into, management inventory.
Yeah.
Try to picture 3 columns. The label on it is taking management inventory. In the first column, we're going to take a look at what it looks like when drugs and alcohol are managing my life for me. And then in the second column, we're going to take a look at what it looks like when I'm clean and sober and I'm trying to manage my own life. And then the final one is going to be, this is what it looks like when God is managing my life for me. Right? Because we talked about powerlessness here, not the mental part of it, but powerlessness to some extent. And now, so the first step is, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives have become unmanageable. It doesn't say that we're powerless over alcoholism. This book is extremely precise and specific. Because when they start out with the program part of it, it says, rarely have we seen a person fail who has thoroughly followed our path. It does not say, rarely have we seen an alcoholic fail who has thoroughly followed our path. So if you have determined that you are an alcoholic of the hopeless variety, it indicates to me that we're dealing with the human condition, not the alcoholic condition. And it also indicates that if you don't identify with being an alcoholic, that the program is open to you as well. We're dealing with a human condition, not an alcoholic condition. Okay, so we admitted we were powerless over alcohol. And that's true for anybody. Like, you take a bottle of water, and if I had a bottle of water here, right, try to turn this bottle of water into a bottle of wine. Good luck with that, right? Why can't you do that? Because I lack the power. Lack of power is my dilemma. I don't have the power to do that. Right. Okay, so you have just admitted that you are, in fact, powerless over alcohol. You don't have to be an alcoholic to do that, to realize that, to admit that.
Right.
Okay? So we admitted we're powerless over alcohol, that our lives have become unmanageable, and that's summed up in the 3 pertinent ideas. A, that we were alcoholic and could not manage our own lives. It indicates that I have an alcoholic condition on top of a human condition, and B, probably no human power can relieve my alcoholic condition. There's nothing I can do about the alcoholic condition, but God can and will if He has sought.
Right. He
will relieve me of the obsession to pick the first one up if I participate in allowing Him to manage my life, and that's a human condition. Right, this program works in Alcoholics Anonymous and Cocaine Anonymous and Heroin Anonymous and Crystal Meth Anonymous and Gamblers Anonymous and all these anonymouses, because it doesn't deal with addiction to a substance. It deals with the human condition, which is a control addiction, right? And the alcoholic is an extreme example of self-will run riot, though he usually doesn't think so, right? Out in the world, when I'm supposed to just be an actor in the big drama of life, and I'm always trying to play the director, and the result of that is I end up being a producer. But all I produce is confusion and conflict. Okay, right? It's a control addiction that I suffer from. And if I see God's help on a human level to deal with the human condition as a control addiction, right? So Step 1 talks about our lives became unmanageable. And I think that for me, my life became unmanageable as soon as I started managing it somewhere in between the age of 0 and 5, right? I was born into this world powerless and couldn't manage my own life. Presumably, my parents were my first higher power, but somewhere between the age of 0 and 5, I started taking over managing my own life and making a mess out of it, and that became readily apparent as soon as I was introduced to a social environment, which was in kindergarten. From that point on, every single week, must have been, somebody was calling my parents with some shit that I pulled. It was either a teacher or a counselor or a principal or a vice principal or the pastor or the Sunday school teacher or a neighbor or a business owner or the cops, or somebody was always calling them up with, do you know what your son did? Right? And the theme was always the same. Your son does not work and play well with others, right? You can identify with that one, right? So that's why I need a program and I need a fellowship. The program is in the book, the fellowship is in the rooms. In the program, there's a whole chapter called Working with Others. It doesn't say working on others, this is working with others, okay? It has Fisher-Price directions on how I can learn to work well with others. And in a fellowship, you go to a meeting, and in most meetings anyway, and you're going to experience a fellowship, a friendliness, and an understanding which is indescribably wonderful. And if I hang around with those people after the meeting or between meetings, that gives me an environment by which I can learn to play well with others.
Right.
That's why I need a program and a fellowship, to learn to A, work well with others, and B, play well with others, if that makes sense.
It does.
I got a little sidetracked there, but coming back to our lives had become unmanageable. From other people's stories that I've heard, apparently their lives didn't become unmanageable until they're in their 20s or their 30s or whatever the case may be. It was later on for them, whereas for me it was off Jump Street. So, and that's a human condition. And okay, I'll get into that when we get into column 2. So the first column is when drugs and alcohol are managing my life. That's what it looks like, and we're going to go to page 21. On page 21, it says, but what about the real alcoholic? And that's typically how I introduce myself a lot of the time, identify myself as a real alcoholic, because I wholeheartedly fit this description. This is what it looks like when drugs and alcohol are managing my life for me. There's an old saying that says, the man takes a drink, the drink takes a drink, and the drink takes the man. And it's laid out in here similarly. But what about the real alcoholic? He may start off as a moderate drinker. He may or may not become a continuous hard drinker, but at some stage of his drinking career, he begins to lose all control of his liquor consumption once he starts to drink. Okay? So once the man takes a drink, then the drink takes a drink. The drink is in control and is controlling how much I drink. And then shortly after that, the drink takes the man, right? Because now I not only lost control over my drinking, the alcohol or the drugs are managing my life for me, and this is what it looks like. It says, here's the fellow who has been puzzling you, especially in his lack of control. Right now, you notice it doesn't say lack of control over drinking, it's lack of control, period, because I lose control over my behavior, my attitudes, my values, my beliefs, my thinking, my emotional nature, over everything. And shit gets insane. And that is not the insanity they're talking about in the book. It gets crazy, it gets chaotic, it gets way the hell off the deep end. Okay, he does absurd, incredible, tragic things while drinking. You identify with doing some absurd, incredible, tragic shit when you're high or drunk, right? Really off the chain shit. He is a real Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, right? We're talking about a drastic change of personality. And it's unpredictable, because I don't know if one night I'm going to have a few drinks and I'm going to go to bed peacefully and I'm going to go to sleep. I've had that experience happen. I don't know if I'm going to end up drinking out of resentment and in a blackout go and shoot somebody's house up, and an hour and a half later end up in an armed standoff with the cops, and then start coming out of a blackout face down in my front yard with 5 cops on my back. I've had that experience. Or I don't know if I'm going to be dancing on the table with a lampshade on my head singing drinking songs. There's Skeeter, I'm a Peter, whack it off. My favorite drinking song, right? The life of the party. It could be any of those and many others. It is completely unpredictable. Once I put drugs and alcohol into my body, I don't know if it's going to end tonight, tomorrow night, the next night, or the next week, and what's going to happen in between. Drugs and alcohol are running my life for me. So he is seldom mildly intoxicated. He is always more or less insanely drunk. His disposition while drinking resembles his normal nature but little. He may be one of the finest fellows in the world, yet let him drink for a day, and he frequently becomes disgustingly and even dangerously antisocial. A lot of people think antisocial means you become isolated and reclusive, and that happens as well, but that's not what they mean here. I become dangerously antisocial. I drink to black out, and I go shoot somebody's house up, and then I get in an armed standoff with the cops, and then I have to go to prison for 11 years. That is behavior that is not acceptable, not deemed acceptable to society, and so extreme that I have to be locked up for 11 years as a result of it. That is disgustingly and dangerously antisocial behavior, right? And even no matter how much resentment I would have had towards him, had I not been drinking to that extent, I never would have done what I did. And it's not that I blame it on alcohol. It's just there's an explanation for that when it comes to doing management inventory work. There's an explanation for that, and that can be a useful experience, and it has been many times, right? No matter how far down the scale I've gone, I get to see how my experiences can benefit others, and that experience has been very beneficial to others. When they sit here, sit and see and hear and feel me talking about what I am, the way that I'm talking about it, and then I'm sharing with them, obviously, with realistic details of the things I've done in the past, that gets their attention. That makes them curious. Okay, it's a useful tool. So if you want to continue on with the rest of that at some future time, I highly recommend it. Page 21 is referred to a lot. Every time you hear somebody get up at the podium and say, my name is so-and-so and I am a real alcoholic, this is what they're talking about right here, is this section in the book. So that concludes column 1. This is what it looks like when drugs and alcohol are managing my life for me. Now, take drugs and alcohol out of the picture. All right, you go to treatment, you go to jail, you try to white knuckle it for a while, or whatever the case may be. You're clean and sober, but you're still trying to manage your own life. You're not living a program of recovery. So then we're going to jump to page 52. This helps do inventory of what it looks like when I'm clean and sober and trying to manage my own life. And they're referred to as the apodevilments. In the middle of page 52, the paragraph begins with, we had to ask ourselves why we shouldn't apply to our human problems this same readiness to change our point of view. Okay? 1, we were having trouble with personal relationships. Have you noticed that when you're clean and sober, you probably have more or a different kind of trouble dealing with personal relationships than when you're high and drunk, right? Because you get in a conflict when you're high and drunk, you're going to get into a fight, or you're going to fuck you, and you walk away, and it doesn't really bother you that much, right? But when you get clean and sober, it's like stuff starts chewing on you, and your mind gets the better of you, and you start feeling some kind of way towards other people, and you feel lonely when you get in a relationship, and people think it's being in relationships with other people that are causing the problems. No, it's me trying to manage my own life clean and sober without God's help that is the root of the freaking problem, not the freaking relationship. If I'm spiritually fit enough and I become involved with somebody that isn't suitable to me, then I will break it off with them and go my separate way, according to the direction that the Spirit gives me. I may go back to it, say, okay, I'm not really convinced that this is not right for me, and I've done that recently in my life. In the last 3 months, got involved with somebody. It seemed to fall apart. I didn't feel it was a clear indication that I should separate myself from it. I went back, and I went back twice until it finally became obvious to me that no, this doesn't work. Now I have to rely upon God for the power to end it and to leave it at an end. Past experiences taught me that that's what I need to do. I would break up, I'd go back, 6 months would go by, I'd get lonely, I'd get whatever, scared, and I'd patch it back up, and then a bad toxic relationship would go on for years and years and years until it blows up, and there's restraining orders filed, and the lawsuits filed, and civil litigation that goes on for years and years, and this whole big mess that I create because I started trying to manage it right from the get-go. Okay? So 1, we were having trouble with personal relationships. 2, we couldn't control our emotional natures. 3, we were a prey to misery and depression. You notice how people get clean and sober. I especially like going to detox and rehabs, and they're bored, and they're miserable, and they're depressed. That's what's supposed to be happening. you're off clean. You're clean and sober right at the moment, and you haven't found a solution, and that's the condition that you should be in. 4, we couldn't make a living. 5, we had a feeling of uselessness. 6, we were full of fear. 7, we were unhappy. And 8, we could not seem to be of real help to other people. The 8 bedevilments. Okay, so this helps me to identify, try to put myself in their shoes, align my experience with their experience, and try to see what kind of a mess that I'm creating. Which they get into more detail when you start getting into steps 3 and 4, but this is a beginning point, hopefully, and sometimes when I share my story about how I had 17 years sober and I fell off, and somebody in the group will come up to me afterwards and they'll want to know, or whatever, they'll want to know what happened, and today I know why they ask those questions, because I used to ask people like that questions like that, and it was out of fear. I wanted to hear what ominous warning that they failed to heed, or what disastrous pitfall that they fell into, and I want to be on my guard and look out for the same thing in my life and make sure that I avoid the same thing. Mm-hmm. It's a fear-based question, but it's a legitimate question I've had to ask myself and be able to explain to other people, find my own experience of it. And one of the reasons is that if I would have stuck around long enough, maybe I would have learned this. But one of the reasons that I fell off is that I clearly understand that step 1 has to do with I'm powerless to stay clean and sober in the first part, and when I am clean and sober, I'm powerless to manage my own life in the second part. Right? So I went off on my own, and I adapted an attitude that God's keeping me clean and sober, and the purpose for my sobriety is for me to be able to go and live and enjoy life and experience all that this world has to offer. Mm-hmm. Right? And so I went about managing my own life, and the problems that were still there, the fears and the hate and the self-will, was all manifested and continuing to grow for years on end. And it was inevitable that I was going to relapse, and I had no idea that was what was going to happen. I had no idea. So it's important that for me, it's become important for me to point out to people that we have an alcoholic condition on top of a human condition. These 3 pertinent ideas, that we were alcoholic and could not manage our own lives, and these are 2 separate things. One has to do with your drinking, one has to do with your human condition when you're not drinking. Right. So when I got clean and sober the first time, I sought God's help to keep me clean and sober, but I never bothered trying to seek His help to manage my life for me. So because I missed that point, I supposition if I ever would have not, but the fact of the matter is that I never sought His help to manage my life for me. I thought as long as He would keep me clean and sober, I got this. I was self-will run riot. And I became a victim of the delusion that I can wrest satisfaction and happiness out of this world if I only manage well, and as long as things were going well, I assumed it was because I was managing well, until all of a sudden it fell apart and I didn't know what to do. Okay, so that's an important, that's column 2, right? Column 1 is this is what it looks like when drugs and alcohol are managing my life. Column 2 is this is what it looks like when I'm clean and sober and I'm trying to manage my own life. And then we have column 3, this is what it looks like when God's managing my life for me. And then we're gonna jump to 83. You're probably really familiar with all that. And this kind of comes around full circle from part of where we were at earlier when we talked about if we are painstaking about this phase of our development. And what phase is that? It's the spiritual phase, right? And they like to call these the 9-step promises, and I have an issue with that because this has nothing to do with the 9th step. It's actually the first half of the 10th step. And that's not to deny the fact that if you are honest and thorough from the very start and you get up to this point, you may have only scratched the surface, but if you've gotten up to this point as best you can, through steps 9, that some of these promises are going to come true for you, I'm definitely not denying that part of it. But what I am saying is that I think it's misleading to people to tell them these are the 9-step promises when, in fact, what it is the first half of the 10th step, right? On page 45, it says, we believe we have written a book which is spiritual as well as moral. Spiritual is before the moral, right? Yeah. So you do spiritual inventory and do moral inventory. In step 4, we made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. And in step 10, we continue to take personal inventory, which is inventory of my person, which according to the book is a spiritual and a moral inventory. And that's what these promises are about, is learning how to do spiritual inventory in my life, the goal of which is to realize, to make real to me concretely in consciousness those things that God has done and is doing for me, which I never could do for myself on my own. That brings in the light. So, if we are painstaking about this phase of our development, we will be amazed before we are halfway through. We are going to know a new freedom and a new happiness. Right? Is that new only once? You get a new bike, you start to use it, and now it's not new anymore, it's always used, right? So is it only new once? No, because it's a continually growing experience. As I continue to learn new truth, as I continue to grow, I grow in consciousness, or grow in the spirit, or whatever label you want to put on that, right? And as I continue to grow in consciousness or awareness of this power in my life, I continue to improve my conscious contact with God as I understand Him, which is the objective in step 11. Yeah. Okay, so this is a main focal point in my recovery, is to continue to see all those things that God is doing for me, which I can't do for myself. As I grow in consciousness or awareness of that, my consciousness grows. A byproduct of that is that I improve conscious contact with God as I now understand Him, because I'm completely reliant upon consciousness of Him. Not knowing that He's there intellectually. I've always known He's there. I was growing up in faith as a child. I knew He was there somewhere doing something. He just didn't have anything to do with me, right? Because I wasn't conscious of His presence. This helps me to remain conscious of His presence and to continue. So I continue to experience a new freedom and a new happiness. We will not regret the past nor wish to shut the door on it. Obviously, I don't regret the past. I'm sharing it freely with you now, and sometimes talking jokingly about the crazy shit that I did, right? We will comprehend the word serenity, and we will know peace. No matter how far down the scale we have gone, we will see how our experience can benefit others, right? I get to see that. Yeah. The feeling of uselessness of self-pity will disappear. And you notice how uselessness, it identified that in the 8 bedevilments, the feeling of uselessness, right? And there was I couldn't have felt any more useless when I was living in a fucking bathroom with a bottle of Jack Daniels or a bong full of weed or a spoonful of dope of some kind or another, right? I had a knot in the pit of my stomach. It had this fear, this impending doom glooming over me, knowing that any day I'm going to end up back in prison and wishing that I would be dead and being convinced that God's not going to let me die. And I'm trapped in fucking hell, right? And today I look for any opportunity to be of use. I regularly get asked by people, well, why do you keep doing this for that person? You know they're not ready. I get questioned about the things that I do for other people, and I have to point it out to them that it doesn't matter whether that man receives anything or not. You know, during the time by which that I'm trying to be helpful to him, I get to feel useful because I am being used by him as an instrument, as an agent. And that is always 1,000% better than living in a fucking car or living in a bathroom with a spoonful of dope, a needle in my arm, wishing I was dead and knowing that God won't let me die. Okay, so that feeling of uselessness and self-pity will disappear. We will lose interest in selfish things and gain interest in our fellows. Self-seeking will slip away. Our whole attitude and outlook upon life will change. Fear of people and of economic insecurity will leave us. And I frequently use this in my shares. I think I used part of it last night, briefly. Most of my life, I lived intentionally avoiding people as much as I possibly could and isolating them, believing that people were the main problem in my entire world. By the time I got out of high school, I was absolutely convinced that if somebody got to know me well enough, it wouldn't take them very long before they would fall into one of two categories, either those that hate me or those that fear me. I was absolutely convinced of that. It took me decades to learn the truth that the fear and the hate that I was experiencing was my own. It wasn't coming from them. Because I was looking at the world through the lens of my own thinking, and I was suffering my own fear and hate. That's why we inventory, resentment, and fear, right? All that shit is mine. And I was projecting that onto the world around me. And then trying to live isolated from the rest of the world as a result of that and causing my own misery.
It almost personifies itself.
Right? Yeah. So, fear of people and of economic insecurity will leave us. Now, I have friends, I have support, I have 230 contacts in my phone. I can call people if I get stranded. I can call people call me when they need help. I'm a part of society. Wow, how the fuck did that happen? Well, for 50 years it didn't happen, and all of a sudden the last 6 years it started happening. It can't be me doing it, right? I have to realize, bring that into consciousness, the fact that God is doing for me what I never could do for myself, right? So we will intuitively know how to handle situations which used to baffle us. We will suddenly realize that God is doing for us what we could not do for ourselves. End of management inventory. I also use this for spiritual inventory. This is a key piece. I don't deny that, but calling them the 9-step promises is quite misleading. And, that's my nature. I sometimes tend to be contradictory. But, I was taught. And it took a long, long time before somebody said, hey, listen to the drunks in the book, not the drunks in the rooms. And boy, did that open up doors. So we'll end with this. We went over the phenomenon of craving in the doctor's opinion, right? So on page 162, and we talked a little bit about hunting grounds earlier. Says, someday we hope that every alcoholic who journeys will find a fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous at his destination. To some extent, this is already true. Some of us are salesmen and go about. Little clusters of 2s and 3s and 5s of us have sprung up in other communities through contact with our 2 larger centers. Those of us who travel drop in as often as we can. This practice enables us to lend a hand at the same time avoiding certain alluring distractions of the road about which any traveling man can inform you. Thus we grow. Now you apply that any way you want. Thus we grow in light of, they're talking about the fellowship, or me personally by following the directions that they're giving me here.
What is that star for at the end of
Asterisk?
Yeah.
Written in 1939. That has to do with the footnote at the bottom.
Oh, okay.
It says, thus we grow, and so can you. Though you be but one man with this book in your hand, we believe and hope it contains all you will need to begin. I've referred back to this quite a number of times in recent months, because it doesn't say, though I be a man who goes to many meetings, though I be a man who has a sponsor, and though I be a man who be sponsoring 16 people. And no, none of that is in here. Though you be but one man, with this book in your hand, we believe and hope it contains all you will need to begin. Not a sponsor, not a home group, not a meeting list. Makes sense? Okay. We know what you are thinking. You are saying to yourself, I'm jittery and alone. I couldn't do that. But you can. You forget that you have just now tapped a source of power much greater than yourself. To duplicate with such backing what we have accomplished is only a matter of willingness, patience, and labor. Okay? So talk about having this book, having God's got my back, and me exerting willingness, patience, and labor. Those are the elements we're talking about here. We know of an AA member who was living in a large community. He had lived there but a few weeks when he found that the place probably contained more alcoholics per square mile than any city in the country. This was only a few days ago at this writing in 1939. The authorities were much concerned. He got in touch with a prominent psychiatrist who had undertaken certain responsibilities for the mental health of the community. The doctor proved to be able and exceedingly anxious to adopt any workable method of handling the situation. So he inquired, what did our friend have on the ball? Our friend proceeded to tell him, okay? He didn't proceed to give him a book. He didn't proceed to give him a pamphlet. He didn't proceed to forward him a meeting list. He proceeded to tell him. and with such good effect that the doctor agreed to a test among his patients and certain other alcoholics from a clinic which he attends. Arrangements were also made with the chief psychiatrist of a large public hospital to select still others from the stream of misery which flows through that institution, right? Nowhere in the first 164 pages does it ever suggest to go to a fucking meeting. Nowhere. This tells me where my hunting grounds are. From streams of misery which flow through institutions. And back in the day, it used to be hospitals, asylums, and sanitariums. And today we have jails, prisons, detoxes, rehabs, halfway houses is the bulk of them. Streams of misery flowing through some institution. Those are my hunting grounds. Okay. So our fellow worker will soon have friends galore. Yeah, I have
think we've been working on
Dozens of them in my phone right now.
Later, bro.
Some of them may sink and perhaps never get up, but if our experience is a criterion, more than half of those approached will become fellows of Alcoholics Anonymous. Okay, and they're not talking about the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous because it didn't have a name at the time this book was published. When this book says Alcoholics Anonymous, it means the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, which is in the book. It wasn't until months later that they decided to name the fellowship after the title of the book and call it Alcoholics Anonymous. So whenever you see that in here, they're referring to the program, not the fellowship. When a few men in this city have found themselves and have discovered the joy of helping others to face life again, there will be no stopping until everyone in that town has had his opportunity to recover, if he can and will. Still, you may say, but I will not have the benefit of contact with you who write this book. We cannot be sure. God will determine that. So you must remember that your real reliance is always upon Him. He will show you how to create the fellowship you crave. Okay, so I jumped to this because in the doctor's opinion, we covered the phenomenon of craving, right? And it's a divine craving. It's implanted in us by God.
Right.
And we never lose that, but it gets redirected. It's a craving for the fellowship of the Spirit. And you can find that in a number of different places. From another book, it says, wherever two or more are gathered in my name, there I shall be. Right. And here we say there is one who has all power. That one is God. When you find him now, right? And one is always capitalized. He's everywhere all the time, right here, right now. And I need to find my version of him deep down within myself. On page 55, it talks about where to find this power. And so He will show me how to create the fellowship that I crave. Our book is meant to be suggestive only. We realize we only know a little. God will constantly disclose more to you and to us. Okay? So this idea that our book is meant to be suggestive only, that you hear so many people quoting out of context all the time, that is only in light of the fact that, taken in context, that our God will determine that, so you must remember that your real reliance is always upon Him. He will show you how to create the fellowship you crave. Our book is meant to be suggestive only. We realize we only know a little, right? It contains everything I need to begin, but once I begin, I find the power. The main object of this book is to enable you to find a power greater than yourself, which will solve your problem, and the problem always centers in the mind. So I get connected up to the power. Power solves the problem, then I commence to go help his kids, and he will show me how to create the fellowship that I crave. Okay, our real reliance is always upon Him. Our book is meant to be suggestive only. Is only in light of the fact that my real reliance is always upon Him, not upon this book. They're making it clear that this is not the solution. This is directions on the path that leads to the solution. Okay, ask Him in your morning meditation what you can do each day for the man who is still sick. The answers will come if your own house is in order, right? So, and it talks about this on page 97 and 98. And this is something that's cliche around the fellowship, and I repeat because it's found in the book. It says, trust God, clean house, help others. And that's directly off those 2 pages out of the program. Okay, but obviously you cannot transmit something you haven't got. See to it that your relationship with Him is right, and great events will come to pass for you and countless others. This is the great fact for us. And here's another suggestion to the newcomer right here. Don't suggest to go get a sponsor. Don't suggest to go to 90 meetings in 90 days. The word sponsor is not in this book, and the word surrender is not in this book. This is the suggestion that's in this book. Abandon yourself to God as you understand God. Admit your faults to Him and to your fellows. Clear away the wreckage of your past. Give freely of what you find and join us. We shall be with you in the fellowship of the Spirit, and you will surely meet some of us as you trudge the road of happy destiny. Not to happy destiny, the road of happy destiny. And until then, may God bless you and keep you sane, safe, and sober.